methodical execution of an American journalist by this terrorist group called ISIS. We know how brutal they are, how little respect they have for human life. The question here becomes, after the murder of this American done for the benefit of the cameras, will there be more? And what threat do they pose perhaps to all Americans? There are reports that more American military are now headed to Iraq because of the threat that ISIS poses. After we heard today from the parents of James Foley, the dead American, and the president. It's where we begin tonight with our chief foreign correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. And Andrea, just tonight we're learning there was a rescue attempt to try to save him?
Yes, indeed. The Pentagon has announced that earlier this summer, the U.S. military tried to rescue Foley and several other hostages from the ISIS site in northern Syria, landing in Syria with helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft and engaging ISIS fighters in heavy fire. But the hostages were not there. The one U.S. pilot was injured in this failed rescue mission. Jim Foley was dedicated, passionate, fearless, and only 40 years old. Mourned today by friends in far corners of the world and in his hometown of Rochester, New Hampshire, by his grieving family. His mother, Diane.
So many people were praying for Jim. And I really think that's what gave Jim an unusual courage. Jim just could feel the prayers.
Foley had been kidnapped for 44 days by Gaddafi forces in Libya in 2011 and spoke about it after his release.
You know, it's not worth your life, no matter what romantic ideal you have, no matter what ethic you think you have. You know, it's never worth that.
But when the civil war broke out in Syria, he was determined to tell the story of the uprising. Today, once U.S. intelligence confirmed that the gruesome beheading video was authentic, President Obama called the Foleys and vowed to pursue his killers.
Jim was taken from us in an act of violence that shocks the conscience of the entire world. We will be vigilant and we will be relentless.
After Foley's brutal slaying, no let-up in the U.S. attacks against ISIS in Iraq. At least 14 airstrikes in the Mosul Dam region overnight. Was Jim Foley killed because of the recently launched U.S. air war? His employer at Global Post believes yes.
I think it was clear that the onset of the bombing, which was done for very good and sufficient reason by our government, perhaps was the thing that sealed Jim's fate.
For 2 years, Global Post led a group trying to get ISIS to release Foley. Balboni says ISIS was willing to negotiate, but after the U.S. airstrikes began, a final chilling message.
There was one communication after the bombing began that went to the family that that stated that Jim would be executed.
Now ISIS is threatening to kill another American hostage, Steven Sotloff, also a journalist, unless the air war stops.
He always wanted to go over and go on adventures in the Middle East, and we were always kind of like, I don't really think that sounds too safe, but there was nothing stopping him. It was a passion of his.
In April, ISIS released French hostages and other Westerners who had been held with the Americans, reportedly for ransom, but the U.S. will not pay terrorists. And it was debriefing those Western hostages, the French and others, that helped the U.S. get the location in northern Syria where they thought the Foley and the other prisoners were. But of course, they failed. Also tonight, the State Department has requested 300 more troops to guard the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and the airport there against the growing ISIS threat in Iraq.